Gartside was born in 1973, was raised in a family that was not Christian. He met a Christadelphian when he was 17 and was baptised 2 years later. Mark is now married and lives in Launceston and attends the Launceston Christadelphian ecclesia or church. And Mark joins Wilderness Conversations to share his story. Mark, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with your childhood. Tell us a little bit about where you were born and the sort of family you were born into, and what sort of childhood did you have?
Well, a lot of the very early years is very limited in my understanding. A lot of it wasn't relayed to me later on in life. A lot of it was sort of buried, you might say, by family. It was a very dysfunctional family, and it's resulted many years later with I have four brothers, so there's five of us in total. We are not close, and it's not any of the fault of any of the brothers. It's just the type of family it was. I was born in Brisbane, and the year I was born, my mum and dad separated, so I didn't really have any understanding of my dad or any of that sort of thing. The two oldest boys stayed with my dad, and the three youngest, and I was the youngest of all the brothers,
Right.
the youngest of them all. The three youngest went with my mum, and we moved away relatively quickly from that area, went to Toowoomba. After, it was only like a month or two later, went to Toowoomba. We're there for a while. We're back in Brisbane for a while, and I don't recall a lot of it, but I do have memories of Brisbane, and I have been back and seen the house. It was like 17, 18 years after I saw the house where I stayed at one point, and I remember a vacant block next to it. And when I got there, the vacant block was still there. So quite an
Right.
interesting memory, because I used to spend a bit of time next door on the vacant block. It was on a river, and we had a jetty and that sort of thing. And so some of those memories were quite interesting. But yeah, once the three youngest went with my mum, we drifted away from whatever the family originally was, which I wasn't sure what it was really like. I've only got recollections of some things and some information that I've been fed of what sort of a family was, and that will naturally come out a bit later on in this conversation.
How old was your oldest brother? So obviously your oldest brother would have known what the family was like. How much older is he than you?
Yeah, my oldest brother, David, he would be, I would say, approximately 8, 9 years older than me. But
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how old he is. That sounds very strange, but that's a little indication of the type of family we were, and we grew up as like that. It wasn't a fun time. There were a lot of difficulties with mental health with my mother, and that had an
Right.
impact while she was with, of course, the two older boys, and before the division took place. But then that course rolled on to the three younger boys for quite a few years later, because they were still with the mother. Yeah, so there was mental issues there as well as alcoholism.
How did she go financially? Because that then translates into financial hardship often,
Yeah,
doesn't
well,
it?
that was tricky. Yeah, that was tricky. I mean, I didn't really understand finance in those days. She didn't. I think she had some money, but not a lot. She needed to be careful how she used it, from what I recall. But there were times when every time there was an opportunity to save money, she would save money. I remember being put in a boot as we were going into like a caravan park or somewhere, so that they could get through with less people.
Yep.
And I'm not sure why, as the youngest, I would have been, the cheapest. But yeah, I got put in the boot.
How old were you when you went back to Brisbane? And what was your life like there?
Yeah, look, it wasn't good. There were quite a few little difficulties, and basically at that age, and it's the same with my older brothers. When you go through extreme family circumstances where something's not right, of some sort of traumatic thing, whatever it is, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, young children tend to go into survival mode and just sort of deal with it, compartmentalize things, and just try to do the best they can. Because the reality is, as a young child, you don't really understand what's going on. It's not until you're maybe 15, 20, 30 years later that you're able to reflect and start pulling some of the skeletons out of the cupboard and understanding what was happening and what went on. So it wasn't a good time. It's really just a matter of, for me, I see it as formative years. I think it was necessary for me to eventually down the track come to the truth. If everything had been rosy and red and beautiful and a lovely sort of family environment, maybe I would have been in a position mentally where I wouldn't have accepted the truth. I wouldn't have seen a need for it, possibly.
Yeah. So as you got older and started to make your own way, where did you end up?
Eventually, the family moved over to Northern Territory from Queensland. Now, that's the mother and the three boys, myself in there. We were in Alice Springs for a couple of years. And then at that point, the issues got quite severe, and I was taken away from my mother by the welfare and was put into a foster family. And the foster family was in Darwin. So then I spent another 2 years in Darwin with the foster family. And then there came a point, and this is again the providence of God I see in my life. There came a point when I'm not sure how it arose or where the conversation started, but I expressed interest, and I think it was the welfare, they come and give you visits. I expressed interest of meeting my mother and finding out if everything was okay again.
To take you from your mother and put you in the Northern Territory, it's a pretty significant move, isn't it? So that's no contact with your mum at all.
Well, I think mother had moved to the Alice Springs, and the welfare took me away in Alice Springs from her in Alice Springs, and then the family was in Darwin, and I moved to Darwin with the foster family. So it was a couple of years, but there was obviously they took me away from her for reasons that were valid. And of course, after a couple of years, they came over, my mother came over, and it seemed quite good. She actually put on quite a good show, you might say, in hindsight, where I thought, well, everything's well again, everything's good. And then I said to the welfare, well, look, I want to go back and live with my mother. So, and that was quite tough on the foster family. And over the years, I sort of regret that in partial way. They were Baptists. They were quite a nice family. But I see the providence of God that if I'd stayed with that family as Baptists, I may never have accepted the truth again. I may never have been introduced to the truth. And so I think from God's point of view, it was necessary that I get out of that Baptist good environment and then back into my mother. And so that basically started another 6 or 7 years of trauma again. From the very first day I got back, from the very first day. So that was quite a shock.
Just reflecting on your time with the Baptists, did they introduce you to Christian principles and so on? Did they attend church regularly and so on?
They did attend church regularly, and I was a part of that in a limited way for 2 years. I did believe in God before that, and I recall, this comes back to the house with the vacant block, I do recall believing in God and asking God questions. I say, if you exist, then this will happen. And if you're real, then maybe this. So somewhere along the line, I had come into contact with someone or enough information to make me believe that there was a God in a limited sense. My understanding didn't go much further than that. But when the Baptists were there, that did enforce for me my belief that there was a God. Yeah. And for me, I knew that was something that was important to me. But of course, I was just a kid. I didn't have any real solid direction. So it was only a back idea. It wasn't front of my mind. My mind at that point was very much survival. Yeah. As a young child in a difficult family. So
you're with them for 2 years. Did you ever go back and meet them, or have you had any contact with them since?
I have. They've been down to Tasmania. There was the father who, the mother has passed away since, and the two girls who are my foster sisters. They came to Tasmania, and they've met Julie, nice. And we've met their kids, and we had a meal down at the gorge, and that was lovely. But there's limited contact with them. Again, it was quite a painful situation, suddenly having someone who's just with you for 2 years and then disappear. So I feel, in a way, a little bit bad, but I was grade 4 or 5. Yeah. I didn't have a full comprehension of what was really taking place in many respects.
So you went to live with your mum. Where was she at that time?
At that point, when I made the decision to move back with my mother, she was then in Western Australia. Wow. She was quite a mover. I worked out by the time I was 26 that we had actually moved. I had personally moved 26 times. Yeah. Different locations by the time I was 26. And that was just a reflection of the childhood. But she was she was south of Perth in a place called Mandurah, which you'd probably know of. So I was in Mandurah then for the rest of my schooling, and I left, I think it was grade 11 I left.
So your latter part of your childhood was really no better than the former?
No, it was really just an extension. The 2 years was a bit of a break. I'm sure there was some purpose in there. Maybe it was formative, the 2 years with the foster family, particularly as they were generally a God-centered family. And I see the providence of God in amongst all this, and some of it's a bit unclear. I mean, providence is an unseen hand of God. I still don't fully understand all the things that went on. As a child, and many other people would understand this, going through extreme trauma, you do learn to compartmentalize and bury stuff. So it has taken many, many, many years to sort of dig some of these things out and try to work it all out and understand it, particularly in the light of the truth. What was God doing? How did he direct me to the truth when I eventually accepted it? Because I think it's all relevant in some way.
When you got to the age of going your own way, how did that work out?
Well, it got to the point where I needed to get out and I did get some help. But a couple of years before I left home, I think I was about 15. I remember it was an extremely difficult point, and I remember being in my room and praying to God. Well, I think it was 15 or it could have been 14 or 15, somewhere around there. And I prayed to God and said, "Look, if you get me out of this, I'll become a Christian when I get an opportunity. I'll become a Christian," because that was my understanding.
Yeah.
I'll become religious. I think may have even been my terminology. I'll become religious. That's my promise. If you can get me out of this situation.
So it must have been pretty dire.
It was bad. It was bad. There was, there was physical. I mean, I'd be sitting eating my dinner, and I ate dinner separately from my mother and the rest of them. Quite strange. And all of a sudden, a projectile, something in the kitchen, would fly past me because I'd be facing the window and back to the kitchen, straight past me and bang against the window. Thankfully, it missed on those occasions. She'd be drinking, of course, as well as the mental issues, and I just had to sort of cope with it. And this is quite a sad little thing to say, but in the years that I was back after leaving the foster family, there wouldn't have been conversations. It would have been, "Can I go out? Okay, I'm home." Just basic. There was no conversations. There was no talking. There was nothing, and it wasn't good from a formative point of view. Very much a social point of view. It wasn't good in developing a young person to learn to communicate, and a whole range of other little. Things were bad, and I made that promise, and I meant it. But again, it wasn't the forefront of my mind. The forefront of my mind was survival. I put it to the back, but I remembered it, and I remembered it as the years rolled by. I still remember it, of course, today.
One of the things that comes to my mind is you often hear horror stories, with regard to the foster system, if you like. But if I'm hearing you correctly, you've actually got a good story to tell around how you were dealt with by the government and how you were supported through the foster time.
I believe so to an extent. I believe what happened in the Northern Territory was good. They obviously picked it up from the school that there were issues. The welfare was very good. Where I think they did fall down was when it was in Western Australia and they came to check up on me. I think that was there was something that had gone wrong there.
Yeah.
Again, I think God's hand was involved, and it was necessary. Yeah.
So you've made this sort of promise to God in your sort of immaturity, really, I suppose. What transpired?
So when I was about 17, my brother, the oldest of the three, Michael, had moved up to Perth some years before, and I had communicated with him and said, "Look, I've got to get out of this situation." So I said, I need to have a solid reason to get out. So I need to really have a job or something. So I went to the school and I got one of those apprenticeship forms. And my brother lived in a suburb in Perth. It was Bentley, near the airport, where there was a TAFE. And they did these pre-apprenticeships. So you can do a full year of theory and it would take a year off your apprenticeship. Oh. So I got this form from school and I looked at all the apprenticeships that were available in Bentley. And I started at the top and I started A, nothing at A. Then it got to B, baker. Ticket, sent it off.
Right.
And I got it. So I spent 13 years as a baker, found out after 6 months that I had allergies to gluten. And so then the next 13 years...
you should have started at Z and worked backwards.
It would have been, or just grab the pencil and close my eyes and put it somewhere on the page. But anyway, that's the way it was. And of course, I learnt many spiritual lessons from the baker, so that was good anyway. So that's how that happened. And then eventually I was able to move up to Perth with that pre-apprenticeship, and that set me up in that for the first 13 years anyway of my working life.
So tell us about being a baker. I know it's a slight digression, but what's life like as a baker? Early mornings, I'm thinking.
Early mornings, late night starts. The shifts are all over the show, and it's all dependent on how the wholesale, if you're doing wholesale or not. Or when the shop opens, you've got to really have it all ready by the time the doors open. And so I never could reconcile myself to sleeping during the day and working at night. But that's what I did, you know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm sensing there's a difference between a baker and a chef. I always look at chefs and think that would be a tough job, the hours they work. Maybe a baker's a bit better in the sense you're at the other end of the day.
Yes and no. I think shift work in any capacity is not fun, especially once the truth comes along and you go to a Bible class and then after the Bible class you go home, get dressed, go to work.
Yeah.
You know, that wasn't always easy. And you're always tired doing shift work. There's never a point where you think, I've had a good sleep. You're always tired. So I feel for those people who do shift work.
Well, where did you live when for the first year, you were doing your TAFE? How did you survive financially?
Well, I stayed with my brother initially, Michael, where he was living in Bentley. And then we managed to get through the Social Security for that first year before I actually got the apprenticeship.
Right.
At an Italian bakery. I managed to get enough money and income through home circumstances, and we had to prove it, just enough to live on, helped out. And then I got the apprenticeship and started to getting an income and that sort of thing. So that helped that first year anyway. My brother was very helpful to get me out of home and get me started.
Yeah. And what sort of trajectory did your life take from there?
Well, it went a bit haywire because I had no real direction. It was all over the place. I was saying to one of my friends who was with me in school, we were best friends for quite a few years. His name was Paul. He was a big Dutch boy, blonde haired like a Viking he was. He was massive. And we were best friends for about 5 or 6 years. And I was asking, come on, you got to come up to Perth. You got to, and here's an opportunity. And he delayed, which was instrumental. So when the truth finally came, there was like a 3-4 week window when the truth came, and then he came up.
Right.
It was a really close call, and he was very instrumental to me to communicating with my dad. So when I finally got contact with my dad, which I think I was about early years 17 or late 16, he would, once I got communication from my dad, he would send the letters to Paul's place, and then he would hand them to me at school.
Right. So while you were still with your mum?
I was still with my mum, so I was able to communicate with him. And believe it or not, my dad was a Christadelphian.
You never knew?
I never knew, because Mum would never talk about him. There was no communication about him. I didn't even know his name. I didn't even know I was a Gartside until something came up at school where I needed to supply my birth certificate. So I went through, I think, to grade 9 or 10. And then at something in year 9 or 10 in high school, I needed to present my birth certificate. So we needed to change my name at school.
Right.
I ended up going through, I was using a last name for one of my mum's partners, a stepfather.
Yeah, but it wasn't your official name.
No. So I didn't even know I was a Gartside till I was, a teenager. So that's how much suppression that there was in the family and difficulty and not telling you anything. So then I suddenly found out I had a dad in Queensland and that he was a Christadelphian. And when I was 17, when I'd moved to Perth, I did go to Queensland for about 2 weeks to see him, since he'd been kind enough to write and communicate. And I thought, I'll go meet him. Look, we didn't get on super great. We're talking about a 17-year-old and a man who we'd never, ever had any communication through our whole lives. So it's not going to be instant. But he did introduce me to Christadelphians. He introduced me that there was something called the truth and that there was something. So it actually started to point me to, if I was going to keep my promise, maybe this could be one of the religions I could look at.
Right.
So when I got back from that holiday, I went to 2 lectures. I think it was 2 lectures at Perth Central, which is, I think, Victoria Park, somewhere right in the heart of the city. And I remember going there, sitting at the back, and one of the brethren, I'm not sure who it was, handed me their Bible, because I went in there with nothing. I didn't have a Bible. And I remember turning these pages and trying to keep up with what the speaker was saying, and there was all these markings in it. But it was just, what impressed me was the fact that someone would quite willingly hand me their Bible. That obviously was a treasured thing for them, and allow me just to use it and turn up the quotes. And that was good. So I went there for a couple of weeks, had a good chat with a couple of brothers and sisters there, some of them telling me that they knew my dad.
Yeah, right.
For me,
wow, that would have been a weird experience.
It was a bit weird because, this is someone who I never knew myself. And there's people there who are quite familiar with him. That was good. But then, again, it was only 2 weeks. And then I think it was getting towards around about the time where I got my apprenticeship. And I had to ride. And then my night shift changed. I was working nights. I couldn't go to any lectures, couldn't go to Bible classes. I lost contact a little bit. And it was a 50-minute ride on my bike from where I was staying through the city to the other side where I did my apprenticeship at the Italian bakery. and then I'd have to ride about midnight, ride back through the city, which was quite difficult.
And I assume all this is happening because you can't afford a car yet.
No, not at that point. No, I had no money. I hadn't yet got a place to stay. I think I was still staying with my brother at that initial point. But when I realised it was quite a long journey and the hours and that, I really needed somewhere to stay closer to where I was doing the apprenticeship. So I started looking out that way.
So where did things go from there? You followed up, you kept contact with the Christadelphians?
Well, no, I lost track again. After those first initial 2 weeks, I was just trying to struggle to keep up with doing this apprenticeship, doing the long hours and doing the night shift. So I eventually got a flat out near the apprenticeship. It's probably about a 10-minute ride, 10-minute ride from where I got the flat and where I got had the apprenticeship. And it was about a week or two after getting the flat that I realised it was on a street called Hector Street. Right at the end of the street was this big block of flats, and it was cheap as anything, and I could afford it. And I remember walking down or riding down the street one day, and from the flats, about 200, 300 metres from the flats on the same street, there's this Christadelphian hall.
Gee, you can't get away from the Christadelphians, can you?
Well, yeah, they just see them pop up. And that was the old Sterling Hall. So I thought, oh, well, that's something. So I knew that they had Wednesday nights. I knew they had Sunday nights. And I knew they had Sunday mornings. And I was working all the nights. So I thought, well, the only time to go is Sunday morning because I can't go any other time because I'm working. So I started going along to the Sunday school. And again, that's when my friend from Mandurah, probably a couple of weeks after that, turned up. He moved up. He moved up in the same block of flats where I was, on the same little level, on the same side, about 6 or 7 doors down. But he started, even when I was at school down in Mandurah, he started to get towards the wrong group of people, started to get involved in drugs and some issues. I'm fairly sure he's worked his way through all that now and resolved it all. But at that time, it was a bit of a dangerous direction. And we did hang out a little bit when he first came up. But by the time he came up, I'd started going to Stirling and started to see, well, this could be what I need to do. And then a few brethren there took me under their wing, very, very thankfully, and made the decision to go through instruction, which took about 9 months.
Yeah. So what's your reflection on those early days? Did it just resonate with you? I mean, it just seems like you made this sort of, can I call it a throwaway promise, like a fairly immature promise to check out religion, and it just seemed to work for you.
Yeah, it did work, but I think, again, I keep coming back to the providence of God. I think God had a plan to do this. If it was just left to me, it would never have gone this way.
Yeah.
As I said, there was little opportunities which, under normal circumstances, no kid in their right mind should leave a great family and decide to go back to a family situation that was disastrous. You know, there was a 3-week window before my friend came up to Perth where the truth sort of made an impact. There was all these little glimpses in my life where God was working. And I think if he hadn't been involved, I don't think I could have ever been able to do it of my own accord. And I guess that comes back to the point that God draws and we don't find the truth. He shows it to us. I didn't believe it initially when I first started going through instruction, in the sense that it was a light bulb moment. But over the course of probably 3-4 months of going through instruction, it was like a dawning.
Right.
I sort of started to realize that this is real. This is what I've been looking for. These things that are being told, they're true and they're making sense, and the whole thing is logical. You know, some people come to the truth because they're convinced by archaeology, and some people are convinced by fulfillment of prophecy. But for me, it was the internal evidence of the Bible itself, how it all tied together and how it made sense. And that's what made the impact for me. And with that slow dawning, there came a point where, because I could only go to Sunday school and the memorial meetings because of my shift work, I'd be sitting through exhortations and none of it would make any sense. And I'd fall asleep through every single exhort for the first 3 or 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
That couldn't make sense, couldn't make head or tail.
Yeah, you would hardly understand them. Yeah.
And no idea. But as I this dawning took place and I started to understand it, particularly towards the end of the 9 months of instruction, all of a sudden they all started making sense. It was just phenomenal for me to suddenly realize that, going from a position where none of it made any sense and I had no idea what you're talking about, and I think I'll fall asleep here, to going to a situation where I was enthralled and I wouldn't fall asleep and I'll follow everything they're saying, that made a big impact upon me as well, upon my mental development, that this is real and this is the truth, and this could be the way I could answer my promise.
What were some of the reflections around what people did well? So, when we think about someone coming into our circle that's looking for the truth, what sort of things were done for you that were helpful?
Look, there were a number of brethren and sisters who just invited me around for lunches, after the Sunday, and they would just talk to you. They'd come to the meeting and they'd just listen to your questions. And look, some of my questions were pretty naive, pretty basic, but they were just to spend the time explaining it, show me from the Bible where the answer was. I remember speaking to a brother saying, "What's this 666 all about in Revelation?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, before I answer that, let's have a look at a couple of other little things." And it just took the time to explain the answers for me, it was great. It all made sense. It was all building on this slow dawning of what is real and what is the truth and what direction was I going to take in life. And I think the trauma of my early years put me into a receptive mind. I certainly wasn't problem free as soon as I left home. I had quite a lot of baggage when I left home, which has taken decades to work through. But I believe it put me into a receptive mind to accept the truth. And so whenever they would talk to me and answer my questions, for me, that was really good. And there are some that spring to mind that I will never forget. They just spent time, they sacrificed their time and energies to have me there, to listen to me, even when I was a bit of a frustrating character to deal with.
Mm. So you were baptised there?
I was baptised at Stirling and started my walk in the truth there.
And where to from there?
Stirling for a few years, and then I went to Perth Central for a few years. And again, I was still working nights through all that time, so I wasn't heavily involved in ecclesial work. I started to do a little bit as the time went on, and I started to get involved. It was all good. But I think my shift work held me back a bit. And then from there, I eventually decided to move. I needed a break. I needed to try to change where I was going. So I moved to South Australia.
Where's the logic in that? What was your decision-making process there?
Well, I sort of trying to work out how old I was when I went to South Australia.
So you've been baptised a couple of years?
No, that would have been about 6-7 years.
6 or 7 years.
Baptised.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think I just needed a fresh break. And again, that comes back to the first 20 years of my life in the truth. There was, I guess there were things that I brought with me from the world, whether my own fault or whether part of my background, that weren't fully resolved. As I said earlier, there's a lot of skeletons in the cupboard. There was a lot of things that I just learned to compartmentalize. I guess being a young person trying to deal with certain circumstances which you can't deal with, you learn to box stuff up and compartmentalize really effectively. And that's something I've had to unlearn in the truth, particularly in the last, say, 12, 13 years. I've had to learn to undo that, not compartmentalize problems, not just box them off. And I was really efficient at it because as a kid, you learn how to do it. You needed to survive.
So I know that if I'm hearing you, what you're saying, so through those years, you're still living a life in one part of the week differently to another part of the week and sort of compartmentalising like that?
I guess in one way you could look at it that way, but I think it was more how I saw life.
Right.
And I don't fully know all the answers to that, but if you're looking at that first 20 years of my life in the truth, I'm not sure where it came from or how it came from or if it came from people or it came from me or where it came from, but I started to go very legalistic.
Okay.
For me, the Bible became a very much a authority, which it should, but in a way that was a set of rules.
It was probably what you needed, seeing you'd come from a chaotic childhood.
It was chaos, and maybe what you're saying is right, that having something so stable was a comfort. At the end of 20 years in the truth, it slowly started to dawn on me, particularly in the 10 years away from the truth, that I had probably grabbed onto that legalistic angle too much because it really got me into trouble. And it really, the 10 years away from the truth was a reflection time to think about the 20 years and earlier of where I had gone wrong, where I may not have picked up the truth probably in the way that God had intended me to do it. And so now, having now come back to the truth, I'm very much in a position where I've been able to step back and look at life as more of from a meditative angle from the Bible, as opposed to my analytical approach to the Bible, if that makes sense. Trying to understand it all, and I could take it to passages like Galatians, which very much deals with that sort of thing, and show myself in that. And I've had to see that for myself. But it means in the last 10, 12 years, I've had to unpack a lot of that pre-truth years and unpack a lot of the life that I grew up with and try to understand it, which hasn't really been fun. Julie's been very good in that regard, where she's been able to unpack a lot of it, because she just seems to keep asking questions about my life. What happened here? Why is this happening? What did you do in the truth here? How did you come to the truth? And she asked all these questions. She's probably the person who has asked the most questions about all the things I don't want to talk about, which has been quite good.
When did Julie come into the picture?
Julie came into the picture during my 10 years away from the truth.
Right. So you went to Adelaide.
Went to Adelaide, yeah.
Attended meetings and maintained your faith in Adelaide for a period of time.
Yes.
And then what happened?
And then I moved to Tasmania. I met someone in the truth in South Australia who was there on holiday. I came to Tasmania and we were married. So we were married for quite some years. So when I left the truth, I sort of left everything. That's what it sort of did to me. I went through a bit of a breakdown of some variety. I had to go on to medication. There was a whole range of things. And apart from my job, which was probably the only thing that kept me sane, I basically lost everything. Lost the truth. I lost my wife. I didn't have children at that point. There's certainly nothing to be proud about from my part, but I do consider it as instrumental from God that he was basically saying to me, Mark, you've really got to look at this again, and you really got to step back and analyse where you've been and what you're doing and what's going on.
So you basically gave up everything. It just was like a mental break.
Yeah, pretty much. And then during that 10 years, I was able then to go back and reflect on things. I had to reflect on everything because I knew, being a legalistic sort of person in the first 20 years, it's an approach where everyone else is clearly wrong and I'm not. That's a legalistic approach. That's generally how it works. It's the tick box system where that brother hasn't done the right thing, so he's done the wrong thing. But naturally, that's suggesting that if I was doing the same thing, I would have done it the right way. So legalistic is like a tick box system. But it got worse and worse, and really that needed to be addressed. And I think God allowed that opportunity to have. But I didn't know that was the problem until during the 10 years. I didn't know I was legalistic. I guess no person in that situation would sort of think, oh, I'm a legalistic sort of person.
Yeah, right.
And I knew something was wrong, because being a legalistic, you're not wrong. When I'm suddenly not in the truth and I've suddenly got nothing, then you're suddenly realizing, well, hang on, maybe I am in the wrong. I started thinking about Job and thinking, well, I'm the innocent little doe or deer or hind that's been mauled by the lion. But as the 10-year progressed, maybe I started to realize that maybe I was the aggressor in many of the instances. Maybe I wasn't so innocent as I initially thought. Maybe I wasn't in the right. So I started going over all the doctrines, because somewhere I was wrong. I didn't know what it was.
Right, so this is all happening sort of on your own while you're living in Launceston, sort of without contact with the Christadelphians or so on.
Exactly, yeah. I had to you get 10 years of reflection and meditation. I had to work it out somewhere. I went over, is there a Trinity? Is there one God? I had to look at everything I believed. And I remember conversations I had with brothers and sisters where I might not have done the wrong thing, and I record them and think, okay, that's no good. And since coming back to the truth, I've been able to approach some of them and say, look, I remember such and such, and I apologize for that. I had to reflect on it all. I had to work it out. And I had to think to myself, if I went down to the local church down the road and I sat there and they were telling me about the supernatural devil, or we go to heaven when we die, could I reconcile that with myself? Could I handle that? And I said to myself, no, I couldn't, because I believe that our reward is on earth. I believe that there's only one God. So that helped me a little way to knowing that I still believed the key doctrines, and that got me through that. Then I had to start to look at maybe it wasn't so much what I believed, maybe it was more something more internal, some problems I had. And again, I slowly worked my way through to this, I guess, this legalistic approach to life in the truth.
Okay, so I'm trying to sort of get my head around what's happening here, and you're probably still trying to do it as well.
Yeah.
You've stepped aside from the truth. Does the truth become just too heavy a burden to maintain? Is that why you leave?
That was one thing. Yes, I did feel when I initially left, there was a twofold mental thing going on. One of them was this overwhelming sense of liberty or freedom from burden. And I don't think that that was a feeling that was coming from the truth. I think that was coming from the fact that my legalistic approach to it.
Yeah.
I felt a release from that. But on the other hand, there was this other thought, which was the loss of the truth itself. And that was hard.
So it's a conflicting thought.
Yes.
So on one hand, you think it's true. On the other hand, it's just such a burden, you almost can't bear it.
Exactly. Yep. I remember waking up first 4 or 5 months after leaving the truth. And you know, there's the first few seconds when you wake up and you don't know what day it is and you don't know what's going on. And I'd wake up thinking, oh, it's all a nightmare. And then the reality would sink in and go, oh, no, it's all happened. That was pretty bad. That wasn't fun. Because I knew what I had was the truth. And I knew that I'd left for a whole range of reasons. And some of them I didn't understand. And I still don't fully understand all the ins and outs of it. But that wasn't fun. But then on the other hand, there's this freedom. And I think that's the freedom from the legalistic approach I was attacking it. And now, many years later, having gone through all that, I've been able to sort of, if I can approach the truth differently and not in the legalistic viewpoint, but more from the point of view of the gospel of the grace of God, taking the phrase from Acts, that look at what God's done for you and be thankful for that, and do the best you can with that basis of the gospel of the grace of God, then, and I don't feel so burdened now from this legalistic approach. I've got a lot to learn. The 10 years didn't cure me from anything, but it certainly helped, and I believe it set my feet on a better trajectory.
So how did that 10 years transpire, and how did you come to the end of that 10-year period?
Well, it was, again, I guess, a slow dawning over 10 years. I had these strange quotes in my head because I was very analytical during my first 20 years in the truth. I had the Bible, a lot of it, in my head. So I was able to draw, without actually opening the Bible for the first 7 or 8 years from being away. I couldn't open the Bible. I just couldn't physically do it. Mentally, I just couldn't do it. So I had to draw upon quotes in my head. And there'll be these quotes like random quotes. Book of Job, there was one, there's hope for a tree if it's cut down that it will sprout again.
Well, that's appropriate.
I know it's a little bit out of context, but for me, they were quotes I'd hang on to.
Right.
There was this random quote in Ecclesiastes which says, there's no discharge in that war. You can't pack up your bag and say, right, see you later, guys, I'm quitting. Once you're a brother of Christ, you're always a brother of Christ, whether you're walking faithfully or not. King Sin is always going to be an enemy, whether you give in to him or not. And that quote, again, was very instrumental. I'm not of the league of someone like Nebuchadnezzar, but I recall that he was 7 years eating grass, and that stuck in my head as well, until he came to his senses and realized that he'd been proud and arrogant and not really put his trust in God. And that was very instrumental. It was about 7 years in that 10-year period of away from the truth that I started to come to my senses. So that made quite a big impact on me. And it was then after that I met Julie during the 10 years, but it was after that 7 years that I really started to tell her about it, because I couldn't not tell her. It was always been in there in my head, and she knew I was religious. She knew some of the things I believed. I would tell her, but I really started to talk to her more. I met Julie not on the basis of the truth. Of all the people I could have met, she has accepted the truth. And again, that's another thing where I see it can only have been God directing that. It doesn't take away my own incorrect actions in amongst it all, but it does show that God is able to bring good out of evil. Because of all the people I could have met, and Julie is from Russia. I met her not in Russia, but I met her elsewhere. And of all the people I could have met, I've met someone who is receptive to the truth. And she's now been baptized, accepted the truth, and the two boys which we have now go to Sunday school.
And somewhat extraordinarily, meeting Julie at that time actually brought you back to the truth, even though she wasn't a believer at the time herself.
I believe she was very instrumental, because she's instrumental in helping me dig out all these compartments that I'd boxed away. And particularly when COVID hit, for me, I was thinking, oh, this is a sign. And I was thinking, well, is this telling us that Christ is close? And for me, I thought, well, I don't want to have to go to Sinai, and even if they're going to come with me, I don't want to have to explain it to them then why we're all going to Sinai. So I started telling her during COVID. I said, well, this is what's going to happen. If an angel comes, this is what's going to happen. And I think she was a little bit confronted by what? But she listened and she's accepted the truth, which is great. And I had to tackle it differently. I was very much a bash the truth into people. That was my approach. I'll try to do it differently now. But with Julie, I had to back off, and I had to approach it gently and carefully, because I had to get it right. Not saying that this is any credit to me, but I had to sort of approach it so carefully, because it's not like you're talking to someone on the street and if they don't agree with it, they can walk off. I had to be very careful in how I was telling her the truth, and how we would deal with some of the issues that Julie had, particularly on things like evolution, because Julie is a biologist and she grew up, believing that evolution was how it originated, and we had to work through that. That was probably the trickiest section that we dealt with. But once she got through that, then there was nothing else holding her back. Even Ezekiel 38 didn't faze her, being a Russian. She accepted that without even blinking.
I thought of that.
I thought that would be one of the hardest things. That was probably one of the easiest. It was the evolution that we found took quite a bit of time to work through.
What's the summary of the evolution conversations? That fascinates me.
At one point, it got to the point where we say, look, if God wanted to use evolution, he could have.
Yeah.
But from the Genesis record and from the Bible that we've got regarding our creation, clear that the creation in record in Genesis is how he chose to use for us.
Yeah.
So that's where I had to sort of approach it from. And the reality is, there may be other creations that God has done through the aeons of time that he has used a different approach. I'm not saying evolution, but we don't know. But for this creation, we're given the details. And I had to approach it from that angle and say, this is all we've got to go on.
Yeah.
And for this creation and for us, this is what we have to use. I'm not saying it's the only method God has, but that's where we left it. And from my understanding, that was my input on it. I know she was starting to, at that point, listen to podcasts, Christadelphian podcasts, and try to get other people's opinions and interpretations of the record, and that helped her as well.
Yeah, okay, great. And so a new phase of life starts for you?
Yes, very humbling, having to come back to the meeting, which is good, because, I don't want to go through 10 years of what I went through, and even before coming to the truth. I don't want to go through all this stuff in my life and not learn something from it. So that is quite tricky. I still remember the first turning up to the meeting. I did speak to some brethren before going back. I didn't just turn up at the door, and basically it came about because I went to a brother's home and who had a little bit of contact with us towards the end of the 10 years. And they had met Julie, and I said, look, Julie needs to get baptized. She wants to get baptized. Can you just sort of make sure that I've taught her correctly, that I haven't missed anything? And then if you'd like to be witnesses, we'll go down to the local lake and you can get Julie baptized, and then we'll just meet at home each Sunday, which was what I basically said. And they said, no, that's not happening. Julie, she can get baptized in the meeting, and you can come along and we'll work through your problems, and it'll be all good.
Did you feel like you wouldn't be welcome, or did you feel like you didn't want to go to the meeting?
Look, I did want to go to the meeting, but that was tempered by the fact that I didn't think I would be welcomed. And that was my problem. That was my perception. Having said that, things had changed in the 10 years. Things have changed a lot in 10 years while I was away that I wasn't aware of. But they have been great. I've never experienced some of the treatment that I've received so well that since I've been back, and the way that they've looked after Julie and accepted our boys, it's been wonderful. It's been a learning experience for me, very much so. But it did throw Julie into a bit of a quandary because suddenly, without knowing any Christadelphians except one couple, within a couple of weeks she's baptised at the meeting and she's a member, and in a couple of weeks after that, I believe I'm welcome back in. And again, I can only see God's hand in that because I had fully intended, and I'd worded Julie up over the year or so before. We're just going to have to meet by ourselves. We're going to have to do our best to bring these kids up the best we can, and we're going to have to just work it out somehow. And that's where I thought we were going. And then within a month, everything had changed. Our whole life had changed. But it was for good because Julie, having come here from Russia, didn't have many contacts. Many people that she knew. She had, a handful of friends in Australia who she could rely on and talk to, but not really a lot of people. And of course, going back to the meeting has been great for her and for me. Just getting my head back into the Bible and then reassessing how I approach it, how I talk to my boys, how we, try to bring them up in the right way. The whole thing has been a really good learning curve.
When you look back over your life, what's one of the key takeaways that you have?
Well, just taking the 10 years away from the truth, the best 10 years of reflection. I'm not saying it's the best 10 years of my life. The best 10 years of reflection in my life, there's no way I could describe all the things I would have thought about during that time. All the reflection, all the analysing of my life. But, if we had to boil out all 4 sections of my life and boil it all down, there's one thing that really stands out for me, which is consistent in all of them, and that is really God's unseen hand manipulating and working and directing. Even when I would make the most stupid decisions and the worst direction changes, and whatever way you want to look at it, with all my problems and sins and personal difficulties, He's worked behind the scenes to where I am today. And that's consistent in all parts of my life, from the time I was born, finding out my dad's a Christadelphian when I'm 17, deciding not to stay with the foster family who were Baptists, moving onto the same street as a Christadelphian hall, meeting someone who had no inkling of the truth or really any real understanding of God, and them accepting the truth. All that boils down to the fact that God is working behind the scenes. And I'm very grateful, because if He wasn't there all the way, I don't know where I'd be today.
It's an extraordinary story.
Yeah, that's the standout for me, yeah.
Yeah. My suspicion is that more people go through what you have gone through than we even know about, because you can go through something similar without necessarily leaving the truth physically. But spiritually, you can go through those sorts of stages in your life. What would be your advice for someone who's perhaps thinking like that at the moment?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. For me, the 10 years away from the truth didn't start a year before I left the truth. That started 20 years. That was building up over 20 years before I left the truth. And I guess then it's just how we really need to just step back sometimes from the busyness of ecclesial life, particularly young brethren, and just sort of reflect on where we're going, and particularly your relationship with your Father, with God, how we're approaching the truth. It comes back to all these, I guess, pride can be an issue. It's hard to sort of narrow it down, but I do feel for a lot of brethren, and I know that I was struggling. I was out of the truth. In a way, I was out of fellowship with God well before I left the truth physically. Because on reflection, I know what I was going through my mind. I know the difficulties. The age in which we live in is not an easy one. Technology, the access to everything that we have, all sorts of things can mess with people. And for me, the reflection years were the best. You needed to sit back and just reflect on your life. Really spend a lot of time in prayer and meditation. And that's one of the things I've learned, and that's one of the things I've really built into my life in the last couple of years, is prayer and meditation. I still study. I still try to get involved. I still communicate. But prayer and meditation is vital for me now. And I've also made a decision in my own mind to just get in there and try to talk to people more at the meeting. Just ask them questions, find out how they're going, and just try talking more. And that's one of the best things we've done in the last couple of years, is get in there, mix and talk to people and just ask them questions and listen to them and tell them about us and ask them about them. And that's something we're trying to do at the meeting as well, where we are, is trying to just talk to people. It's not always easy, because I still have the way I grew up. I still have this personality traits where I find it hard to communicate. I'm more reserved. I like to compartmentalize, which I'm trying to fix. But talking to people, so prayer and meditation on one hand in your own private mind and life, but just talking to brothers and sisters at the meeting without trying to push an agenda or state your own case or justify yourself or whatever it is. Just listen and talk and just enjoy their company, because these are the people that we're going to be spending eternity with. And that's one of the things I've brought out of 10 years away, because I didn't realize it before, but after 10 years I realized I did miss my brothers and sisters. Singing the hymns, I missed a lot of those things, but I missed my brothers and sisters. So that's something I've really learnt. So maybe that was a reflection upon the fact that I didn't really appreciate them in the first 20 years in the truth.
You mentioned compartmentalizing a few times. You're unpacking that, or you're trying not to do that?
Yes.
What's that look like?
I'm regularly doing it, unpacking my life. It's not fun at times, but it is rewarding, going over not only what actually happened in parts of my life, but why it happened, particularly from my perspective. What was I thinking that made me make that decision, or what was I thinking and what was the motive behind why I said what I said, and that sort of thing. And that's how I've been able to sort of work out that I was going very legalistic. And what I'm trying to do now also is not pack stuff up as it's happening, because as a young person, as things happen, you just pack it away, because I was taught to do it. And now, as the problems arise, instead of just packing it away, spend a moment to say, well, when I said that, or when you said that, can you just explain that a bit better? Or I actually go out to brethren, like I speak to them on a Wednesday night, realise I've said something wrong, and it's about just a misunderstanding of how I've interpreted a passage or something. So I had to go back to them on Sunday. I said, now on Wednesday I said this, I actually said the wrong thing. What I should have said was this. And instead of packing that away and boxing it away and never dealing with it, I've just dealt with it as fast as I can. And it's never had a need to go into a box now. So, but it doesn't mean that there's not a closet full of boxes that still need unpacking over the years. And then I'll work on that over time.
Some great advice there. Some final thoughts from you, Mark?
One of the things that's really helped me in recent years, there's brethren today who make an effort every Sunday to come up, and not just me and Julie, but many other people as well. And they make an effort to say, hello, how you going? And you see them working their way around the brothers and sisters, you know. And I think a lot of the brethren, and I'm saying young brethren because I'm putting myself in that category, who may be going through difficulties, really need that. Not just what do we say to people, or how do we handle someone who's left the truth? Because that's not the start of the help. It's almost too late if they've left the truth. And I feel that, yes, you've got to try to communicate with these people in a limited way, just enough to let them know that without any judgment, we are here when you need to talk, which is what some brethren did for me. But really, we need to sort of try to talk to these other people, and that's what I mean by communicate with them, see how they are, how you're going. So when difficulties arise, there's already a communication basis there, and you can then just continue that. And there's a trust being developed over a period of a few years. So when the trouble comes to them or the trouble comes with you, there's already a line of trust. And one of the things that did drive me from the truth is I'd lost my trust. And that was part of my mental problems that I had when I left the truth. But that's something that I see as vital. There's got to be a development of trust between brethren, where they can just talk to each other freely without any judgment, and just enjoy their company, knowing that we're all at different levels in the truth and different stages and different time periods of how we're developing towards the kingdom. And that, for me, is vital, that communication. Yep.
Mark, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
No, thank you very much for having me, Steve. It's been great, and being able to have that discussion has been really good. And I appreciate your questions.